All right, hello ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for listening to Mr. Laxton's video on this Chapter 5, 5.3 through 5.6 practice test. All right, so to start off here, we got some 4 simplifying ones, so we have to simplify these radicals here. So if I have the square root of 27, I look at these perfect squares. I look at 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49. So you look at which ones of these go into 27. So I look at 27 and say, hey, that breaks into the square root of 9 and the square root of 3, because I know that 9 goes into 27 3 times. But I know that the square root of 9 is 3, so I have 3 square root of 3, and don't forget plus or minus there goes on that guy. All right, number 2 going on is 5 over the square root of 8. We do not like this square root on the bottom, so we can't have square roots on the bottom, so we have to make sure that we multiply it by the square root of 8 to get it out of there. So we multiply by the square root of 8 to the top and the bottom. So this guy becomes, and the reason why we do that is this becomes the square root of 64, but I know the square root of 64 is 8. So now on the top I have 5 square root of 8, and then on the top the square root of 8 can break into the square root of 4, square root of 2, and then I know the square root of 4 is 2. So I have 5 times, my series, I have 5 times 2 times square root 2, and then I look at 2 over 8, and hey, I know that 2 over 8 simplifies to 1 over 4, so I have 5 square root 2 over 8 here. All right, awesome. So that one's simplified. No more radicals in the bottom. Number 3, the square root of 49, or negative 49. If I have a negative number, I always break out the square root of negative 1. So I break out the square root of negative 1, the square root of 49. I know that the square root of negative 1 is I, and the square root of 49 is 7. So to be most correct here, my answer would be plus or minus 7i for that guy. All right, so always break out that negative, and then the square root of 49 is 7. So going on to number 4, last simplifying one here, I have 3 times the square root of negative 48. So I always break out of negative 48, I always break a negative 1 out of there, so this is going to be 3, negative 1, and positive 48. So as I go along here, I have 3i, because the square root of negative 1 is I, and then the square root of 48, I have to look at, hey, which ones of these go into 48? And I know that 16 goes into 48 3 times, so I'm going to break 48 into the square root of 16, square root of 3. So now I look there, and I know that the square root of 16 is 4, so I have 3i4 square root of 3, and then I can multiply the 3 times the 4 to give me 12i square root 3. Technically a plus or a minus on there as well. All right, so simplifying those guys, take out those perfect squares. The next one, number 5, is asking us to solve by using square roots. So as I go through and solve by taking square roots, you have to isolate this x squared term here. So I have to get that all by itself. So I add 13 first to both sides. So now I have 5x squared is equal to 15. Divide that guy by 5, divide by 5, I get x squared equals 3. Now I take the square root of both sides, the square root cancels out the square, so I get x equals plus or minus square root 3. So square root 3, you can leave that in your answer, it's not a very nice number, and you can't factor any of those other guys out of it. So now as I look at number 6, the same deal here, but my x plus 3 is the thing that's being squared. So I have to add the 9 over first. Now I have 3x plus 3 squared is equal to negative 156. I add 9 to that guy. Last thing, to get these all by itself, got to divide by 3. So now I have x plus 3 squared is equal to negative 156 divided by 3 is negative 52. All right, so as I keep going on here, now I can take the square root to cancel out that squared. So now I have x plus 3 is equal to the square root of negative 52. So I know out of there I'm going to have to break out an I. And then I also know 52 can break into 4 and 13. So now I can subtract that 3 over, subtract the 3. So now my little step here is x equals -3 plus or minus, and the square root of 4 is 2i square root of 13. All right, so be careful there. That's a good process. You have to do a simplifying step in there as well. So that's a good one. Number 7, solve this one by completing the square. So that's that 5, maybe 6-step process that we've been talking about in class that you have. That first step process, you have to add 51 to the other side. So I'm going to add that 51. And then now here's where we add those boxes in. So I have x squared plus 14x plus box is equal to 51 plus box. All right, so now you have to ask yourself, hey, why did I put that box there? What goes in it? Remember that we talked about in class, b over 2 squared goes in that box. So now my b is 14, 14 divided by 2, and square that. 14 divided by 2 is 7, squared is 49. So I put that 49 in that box. So I go 49, 49. All right, so now you have to ask yourself to factor this left-hand side. So I factor it by putting 49 on the top, 14 on the bottom. So the reason why we added 49 and not any other number in the whole wide world is because 7 times 7 gives me 49, and it adds to give me 14. So this guy becomes x plus 7 squared equals 51 plus 49 is 100. All right, take the square root of both sides. So now I have x plus 7 is equal to the square root of 100, which is plus or minus 10. All right, subtract that 7, subtract the 7. So now I get x equals -7 plus minus 10. So that would be fine if you left an answer as that, but I look at that and I say -7 plus 10 is going to be 3, and then I look at -7 minus 10 is going to be -17. All right, so you get 3 and -17 for your 2 answers. All right, looking at number 8 now. Number 8, same process here. You got to add that 28 to the other side. Add 28. So now I have 2x squared plus 10x plus equals 28, excuse me. And the reason why I didn't put boxes in at that time is because my a value here is 2. So remember that second step in that process, if your a value is not 1, you have to divide each term by 2. So now I have x squared plus, excuse me, and this is where I made my mistake as well, yours should be 12. This should be a 12x here. So this is 12. I told you to change that in class. So that should be a 12. So 12 divided by 2 is 6x plus box is equal to 14 plus box. All right, so if you make that 12, that's my mistake. It'll come out to be some nicer numbers here. All right, so now again, here's where we add that b over 2 squared. So now my b is 6 over 2, and square that is going to be 3 squared, which is 9. So I add 9 into both those boxes. All right, factor that left-hand side. You put 9 on the top, 6 on the bottom. So you get 3 and 3. So you have x plus 3 squared is what this turns into. Equals now 4 plus 9 is going to be, or 14 plus 9, excuse me, is going to be 23. Take the square root of both sides. So now I get x plus 3 is equal to the square root of 23, which can't simplify. None of those things go in it, so you can just leave it as the square root of 23. Now subtract that 3, subtract the 3. I get x equals -3 plus or minus square root of 23. All right, awesome. So as we keep going here, that was completing the squares. Flipping over to the back is the quadratic formula. So this one is where you find that a, b, and your c, and you go through and plug them in and simplify. So here we go to start this guy out. Let's switch to purple. My a is 3, my b is -2, and my c is -8. So as I plug this guy into this formula here, that you have there for you. X equals the opposite of b, which is going to be 2, plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is -2 squared, minus 4. My a is 3, and my c is -8. All right, and on the bottom, of course, is the 2 times the a, which is 2 times 3. So as I go through and simplify this is the hard part where students seem to get caught up. I have 2 plus or minus the square root. Negative 2 squared is 4. And then this is where you have to be careful. I have 1 and I have 2 negatives. So 2 negatives is going to make a positive. And then 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 8 is going to be 96. So here, all over 6. This makes 2 plus or minus the square root of 100 over 6. And I know the square root of 100 is 10, so I have 2 plus or minus 10 over 6. So now as I look to get my two answers here, I have x equals 2 plus 10 is 12, divided by 6 is 2, and 2 minus 10 is negative 8, divided by 6. So I have x equals negative 8 over 6, which is equal to negative 4 over 2 for your final answer there. Excuse me, 3. So I got to divide 2 out of each of those guys, negative 4 over 3. All right, so as I go on to number 10, I have to get 0 on the right side here. So I'm going to add 9x to both sides, and I'm going to add that 6 to both sides. So I have 3x squared plus 9x plus 6 is equal to 0. So now I have an A, I have a B, and I have a C. So as I go along to simplify this guy, I have x equals the opposite of B, which is negative 9, plus or minus the square root of B squared, which is 9 squared, minus 4 times 3, which is my A, and then my C, which is 6. On the bottom here, this guy turns into 2 times 3, which is 6. So as I simplify this guy, I keep going down, I get negative 9 plus or minus the square root of 81. Notice here I only have 1 minus, so it's going to be minus. And then 4 times 3 times 6 is 72. All over 6. Simplify this guy even more underneath that square root. I get negative 9 plus or minus the square root of 81 minus 72 is 9. Divided by 6. So now if I flip down here, I know that I have negative 9 plus or minus 3 over 6. So my two answers here are going to be negative 9 plus 3, which is negative 6, divided by 6 is negative 1. And then for my last answer, I have negative 9 minus 3, which is going to be negative 12, divided by 6 is going to be negative 2. So I get x equals negative 2 for that guy. All right, so going through simplifying these guys in the quadratic formula. Just some definitions here for number 11. I is the square root of negative 1. I squared is negative 1. I cubed is I, and I to the 4th is 1. All right, so that's just kind of some definition things. Got to know them. So now as I go on to number 12, these are simplifying with some i's. So I have i's. You can just treat them just like they're x's. So just multiply them or add them or do whatever they're asking you to do, just like they're x's. So I have 2i times 7i is going to be 14i squared. So remember, if we multiply, that I turns into an I squared if we multiply an I times an I. But I know that I squared, we just set up there, is negative 1. So I plug in negative 1, so now I just have 14 times negative 1, which is negative 14. So as I keep going on here, the next one, be careful. It's just asking you to subtract. So the common mistake here is that students are going to FOIL this guy together. So it's just asking you to subtract, so just combine those like terms. So just subtract like terms here for this guy. All right, so now I like to add the opposite, so I'm going to make that into a plus, this into a positive 8, and this into a negative 12i. So I'm adding the opposite here instead of subtracting. So now I combine these like terms. I have 3 plus a positive 8, which is 11. And then I have 6i plus a negative 12i is going to be negative 6i. Okay, not I squared, because we're just combining like terms, not multiplying. All right, as I go on to the next one is asking you to multiply. So that's where we FOIL. So I bring the 7 on each of those guys, the negative 2 on each of those guys. So 7 times 5 is 35. 7 times negative 9i is negative. Oh, where'd it go? There it went. 7 times negative 9 is going to be negative 63i. Negative 2 times 5 is going to be negative 10i, and negative 2i times negative 9i is going to be positive 18i squared. So don't forget that I times I is I squared. So now you can go through and simplify some things here. I can combine some i's and some i's, and then I know that my I squared is negative 1, so I'll plug that guy in. So I have 35, and negative 63 minus 10 turns into negative 73i. And then this is going to be turn into minus 18 because the 18 times negative 1 is going to be negative 18. So now I can combine the 35 and the negative 18, so I get 17 minus 73i for that guy there. All right, so go through, simplify that guy. Foiling. Number 15, you have to FOIL both the top and the bottom because you have to get that I out of the bottom. We don't like the I in the bottom. So what we're going to do is multiply by the conjugate. So if you remember in class, we have 9 plus I is the conjugate. So I multiply by 9 plus I on the top and the bottom. So now I go through and FOIL the top and the bottom. So I have 3 times 3 is 9, or 3 times 3 is, 27. 3 times I is plus 3I. 2i times 9 is 18i. And then 2i times I is plus 2i squared. All right, so as I go through here on the bottom, I have 9 times 9 is 81. 9 times I is plus 9i. Negative I times I is going to be negative 9i. And then I times negative I is going to be negative I squared. So notice here is that, hey, I have this negative 9i and this positive 9i on the bottom. So that's the reason why we multiplied it by that conjugate, is because these guys cross each other out. So now if I simplify on the top here, if I bring it down here, I'm going to have 27. 3i and 18i combined to positive 21i. And then this is going to be minus 2 because I squared is going to be negative 1. As I look here on the bottom, I only have 81 minus, and then I squared is negative 1. So it's going to end up being a plus 1 there. So as I go through and simplify this guy, I have 27 and negative 2 makes 25 plus 21i all over 82 as I simplify that. Perfect. So notice here 2 negatives make a positive, and notice that there's no i's in the bottom. We can't have i's in the bottom in our answer. All right, so to finish this guy off here, we got one last problem. It's asking us to use the discriminant to find how many solutions. So we have to find, is this graph, does it hit the graph just barely at 1, like right there, or does it hit it twice, or does it not hit it at all? We have to find out what kind of U-shaped, parabola-shaped graph we have here. So as I go through, this discriminant is not on here, but you should memorize that the discriminant is b squared minus 4ac, just the part that's underneath the square root. So now I have an a, I have a b, and I have a c. As I plug these guys in, I get negative 3 squared minus 4a is negative 2, and my c is 4. So as I simplify this guy, I'm going to have negative 3 squared is 9. Notice here again, 2 negatives are going to make a positive. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 4 is 32. So I end up here with 9 plus 32, which is 41. So that 41 goes in my discriminant, 41. And I know that since 41 is greater than 0, so that means I have 2 real solutions. So 2 goes in the number of solutions, and then the type of solutions is real. So remember here, if it's equal to 0, the discriminant, so if you got 0 here, I would have 1 real. And if it was less than 0, like if it was a negative number, I would have 2 imaginary. All right, so remember that for the test. But since this one's positive, we get 2 real. All right, so that is it. A lot of good stuff there, solving quadratics and finding out. If you have any more questions, please come find me so I can answer them so you're ready for the test. Thank you for listening.